What's the difference between ethics and law? In De Republica, Cicero wrote, "Of Xenocrates, one of the noblest of philosophers, it is said that when he was asked what his disciples learnt of him, he replied, to do that of their own choice, which the laws enjoined them to do." In this formulation, we see a distinction carved out between law and ethics. If a society was filled with ethical people, there would be no need for law. So, in that sense, the law is merely an externalized form of ethics. It's what happens when everything else fails. As Benjamin Franklin said, only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. As a nation becomes corrupt and vicious, they have more need of masters. John Stuart Mill mentions this too in Considerations on Representative Government. He says that a republic requires an active population, whereas in a tyranny, the people are encouraged to remain passive. In a republic, every citizen is expected to be a sort of de facto deputy of the police, imposing citizens' arrests where they encounter wrongdoing, whereas in a despotism, if people see someone being mugged, they cross over to the other side of the street, saying, "It's not my responsibility, let the police take care of it." Mill wrote, "A people must be considered unfit for more than a limited and qualified freedom, who will not cooperate actively with the law and the public authorities in the repression of evildoers. A people who are more disposed to shelter a criminal than to apprehend him, who like the Hindus will perjure themselves to screen the man who has robbed them, rather than take the trouble to expose themselves to vindictiveness by giving evidence against him. Who like some nations of Europe down to a recent date, if a man poniards another in the public street, pass by on the other side, because it is the business of the police to look to the matter, and it is safer not to interfere in what does not concern them. Required that public authorities should be armed with much sterner powers of repression than elsewhere, since the first indispensable requisites of civilized life have nothing else to rest on." Mill refers to such people as morally stunted, saying of them, "Nor is it only in their intelligence that they suffer. Their moral capacities are equally stunted. Though the newspapers are littered on a daily basis with women being raped in front of a whole crowd who did nothing to stop the crime, such as in the recent case of Fiston Nugai in Philadelphia, who raped a woman on a SEPTA train while onlookers did nothing. A classic example of this phenomenon, is used both in American and British psychology classes, is that of Kitty Genovese, whose murder presented an object lesson in public apathy. On March 13, 1964, she was chased by a stalker who stabbed her to death. Though there were 38 witnesses, not a single person intervened to help her or call the police. The worst part of all was that her killing was completely random, carried out by a man named Winston Moseley. In the grip of a manic compulsion, he later told police, "I had an uncontrollable urge to kill. When I got such a thought, it remained with me regardless of what else I might be thinking. I had a hunting knife that I had taken from a previous burglary, and I took it with me." What was almost as troubling as the crime itself was the reaction of the people who lived in surrounding buildings, who did nothing to stop the act. When interviewed later by investigators, they said things such as, "It was none of my business. I couldn't make out what she was saying. I thought some kids were having fun. Frankly, we were afraid. I was tired." Chief Investigator Bernard Jacobs remarked, "They were in their homes near phones. Why should they be afraid to call the police?" Jacobs admitted to the fact that there was then no law compelling them to intervene in the commission of a crime, but asked, "Shouldn't morality oblige a witness to do so?" This case illustrates the limits of law, which is the least that someone can do, as opposed to ethics, which asks for more. In Principles of Biomedical Ethics, Childress and Beecham talk about how moral excellence should be aspired to, not perfunctory box checking. They write, "If we only expect the moral minimum of obligation, while ignoring moral ideals, we deprive people of behavior that is worthy of aspiration." They touch upon the subject of a scientist conducting human experimentation and add, "Consider the clinical investigator who uses human subjects in research, but who only asks, 'What am I obligated to do to protect human subjects?' This investigator's presumption is that once this question has been addressed by reference to a checklist of obligations, for example government regulations, he or she can ethically proceed with research. By contrast, in the model we are proposing, this approach is only the starting point." In A Short History of Ethics by Alistair McIntyre, he writes, "Mutual self-interest leads men to combine in setting up constraining rules to forbid aggression and lust, and powerful agencies to inflict sanctions on those who break the rules. Some of these rules constitute morality, others, law." So McIntyre too distinguishes between morality and law. Susan Liboteau, in her book, The Power of Ethics, writes, "I was only beginning to understand that even where the law is clear and the courts are accessible, the legal system can still fall short. I also started to see that even where the law does offer protection, it is on all of us to hold ourselves to a higher standard." She adds, "Even where the law does operate effectively, it is the lowest common denominator, not the highest or even a sufficiently high standard of behavior. Ethics must operate above and beyond the law." All of this is important to note, But it should not be forgotten that though ethics and law are two different things, ethics should be used to inform law, as Hans Kelsen points out. In his Pure Theory of Law, he writes, "Those norms, then, which have the character of legal norms, in which certain acts, legal or illegal, are the objects of the science of law. The legal order which is the object of this cognition is a normative order of human behavior, a system of norms regulating human behavior. By norm, we mean that something ought to be or ought to happen, especially that a human being ought to behave in a specific way. This is the meaning of certain human acts directed toward the behavior of others." So what Kelsen refers to as norms, or what in philosophy might be called archetypes, or in engineering, models. These are the standards by which all other acts are judged. So Kelsen's conception of law is akin to the sort of externalized ethics that Immanuel Kant described when he said that the anthropologist describes what is, whereas the ethicist describes what ought to be. Law is based on the ought, kind of like how Socrates describes the three basic types of human motivation, whereby he says that some people are motivated by sensual pleasure, while others are motivated by honor, and yet others are motivated by truth. Think of society as a pyramid with these three groups. Truth-based people at the top, these would be like philosophers or scientists and people like that. Honor-based people in the middle, these would be soldiers, judges, police officers, etc. And sense-based people, the most numerous, on the bottom of the pyramid. At any rate, those who are motivated by truth experience ethics internally by means of their conscience, whereas those motivated by honor experience ethics as an externalized code, named honor. Hence why William Devenant aptly wrote, "Honor is the moral conscience of the great." Unfortunately, sense-based people have no regard whatsoever for ethical behavior. It's neither internalized as a conscience, as it is in truth-based people, or externalized as a sense of honor, as it is in honor-based people. Because of this third demographic in society, namely, these sense-obsessed people, police states rise up. Laws, namely behavioral codes enforced at the end of a gun, are a function of having a majority of your population being sensed-based. We need less government, more responsibility, and with God's help, a better world. That's what the John Birch Society is all about. Check them out at jbs.org.